I feel honored to be invited to come and speak to you. I'm not sure if I'm the real expert here on vegetarian diets, because the number of articles that I have been sent from British Columbia coming to me, let the dietitian look at these articles on vegetarian diets. I started to get really nervous, and I thought, okay, I'm sure that the audience is going to be more knowledgeable than what I consider myself not to be. So anyway, I arrived yesterday from Ontario. I got up at 3 o'clock in the morning. After that, I couldn't fall asleep. So what do you think I was doing at that time? Reviewing my talk? No. I was just waiting to get ready, come down for breakfast in the morning, and get started with the day. So to start with, no talk about vegetarianism can start without this slide, because we know that vegetarianism encompasses following a plant-based diet with the exclusion of all animal flesh. And there are lacto-vegetarians, which sort of I am, because people want to know if I am a vegetarian. And lacto-vegetarians who use dairy products, ovo-vegetarians that use eggs, vegans who avoid the dairy and the eggs and the animal flesh. Then there are pescatarians who do eat fish, and semi-vegetarians, or you call them flexitarians, who would be vegetarians most of the time, but once in a while they feel it's okay to, I have patients who say to me, I follow a vegetarian diet, but once in every couple of months I really have the desire to eat a steak, and I go ahead and eat it. So that's not a bad way to be. So before I even say much, my first polling question is going to be, I just wanted to get a sense of who is here. So do you want to answer that question? Should I go? Okay. Not bad. So that sort of gives you the idea of the prevalence, which is not far from what the statistics tell us. So when we go to the next thing, which is, why do people follow a vegetarian diet? It could be lots of different reasons. When you go to vegetarianism, it started as early as 6th century BC in ancient India and Greece. And it could be because of religious reasons. It could be ethical reasons. You want to be advocate for animal welfare. You don't want violence towards animals. Or it could be the availability of meat, or it could be your affordability to buy meat. It could be environmental reasons. You want to have the footprint not being affected by raising animals. And more than anything else, I think what I'm seeing lately is that people are turning to vegetarianism for health reasons and for prevention of disease. Did anybody see this article in the Globe? It was there about maybe 3 months ago. Is meat cooked? So it talked about environmental reasons and not the health part of it, but the other reasons that the sale of meat is going down and things like that. So the polling question number 2, what are the reasons your patients choose a vegetarian way of eating? Let's see if it jives with what we want to see. Ready? Well, it's pretty well spread out, actually. But health still comes to be the main reason here. Okay, so what's the prevalence? So in 2015, the stats show that 12% of young Canadians claim to be vegetarian compared to 5% of Canadians 50 and older. BC has the largest share of vegetarianism, and it has been going up because in 2012, it was 1.2%. In 2015, it was 13%. It has already gone up to 16% in 2018. There was a poll done by Dr. Charlebois in Dalhousie University in March, and they showed the prevalence of vegetarians 7.1% versus vegans 2.3%. So they found that the younger generation is more going into vegetarianism, females predominantly more than males, and higher the university education, the higher the prevalence of choosing vegetarianism. So this could have impact over next 20 years. You'll see maybe more people will be going and following that route. So what about the prevalence of vegetarianism in chronic kidney disease? So there is not very clear information available in that. Here and there I've come across maybe 5%, but I'm not quite sure of that. And we see that the prevalence of hypertension, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and obesity is reported to be lower in vegetarian population. And we know that the plant-based diets are associated in a decrease in risk factors which are associated with the CKD progression. So would it have renal consequences if all the causes of kidney disease are lower in vegetarians? We will look at the healthy population, and we'll look at people with chronic kidney disease. So when we look at nutrients, the vegetarian diets tend to be rich in, let's say, fiber, some of the minerals, vitamin C, potassium, magnesium, phytochemicals, carotenoids, and so on. And they tend to be low in omega-3 fatty acids, zinc, and iron. But when you look at the vegans, compared to the vegetarian, the vegan diets tend to be lower in calcium, vitamin D, B12, and we'll be looking at all these things later on. So you look at this study, which is the EPIC Oxford study, which looked at the energy and nutrient intake in vegetarians. And there were 65,000 subjects. Half of them were meat eaters. Now, these were the people who were matched for social class and lifestyle with the vegetarians. So vegetarians had a 5% lower energy intake, but the vegans had 14% lower energy intake. Vegetarians had more carbohydrate in their diet. Their protein as percentage of energy was about 13% versus 16% for non-vegetarians. Saturated intake was lower, as was to be expected. And there was no significant difference in height, weight, BMI between lifelong vegetarians and those who became vegetarians at older than 20 years of age. Although, many reviews that I've looked at show that the BMI is lower in vegetarians. The fracture rate, there was no difference between vegetarians and non-vegetarians, but the risk was 30% higher in vegans. So when we look at the position paper on vegetarian diets put out by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, their statement is that a well-planned vegetarian diet, which has variety and can meet the calorie requirements, is suitable for all stages of life cycle, to athletic performance and pregnancy. And it has health benefits associated with it in the lower incidence of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, hypertension, cancer, and mortality. So when we look at this prospective cohort study of US healthcare professionals and nurses, this is about looking at all-cause and cause-specific mortality. And this is, of course, a healthy population. Data was analyzed, and the median protein intake is assessed by percentage of energy intake. So 14% of the calories came from animal protein, and 4% came from plant protein. So animal protein intake was not associated with all-cause mortality, but it was associated with a higher cardiovascular mortality. But the plant protein intake was associated with lower all-cause mortality, that is of 10%, and lower cardiovascular mortality of 12%. But these results were confined to participants that had at least one unhealthy lifestyle factor. And what were those factors? If you were into smoking, if you had heavy alcohol intake, if you were overweight or obese, and if you were physically inactive. So that's where it applied to. So here, what happened is they found that replacing animal protein of various origins with plant protein was associated with lower mortality. And the hazard ratio for all-cause mortality, when they substituted just 3% of the calories from plant protein, substituting it for processed red meat, the hazard ratio for mortality decreased by 34%. And if you replace the plant protein with unprocessed red meat, it reduced by 12%. And even for an egg, it reduced by 19%. So that sort of stresses the importance of protein sources. Then this was another article that came out just in the last month or so. I thought I'll just include it for interest's sake. This was a systematic review of prospective cohort studies. Of the 361 articles extracted, only 7 were included in the review because they met the criteria. And 5 reported a protective association for dairy consumption, particularly low-fat dairy, against new development of chronic kidney disease or rapid decline in kidney function. However, 2 studies did not find such association, but they didn't find it harmful either. So that was the healthy population. So what about in chronic kidney disease? In NHANES 3 data, the participants were stratified by GFR. So you either have less than 60 ml, less than 60% kidney function, or more than 60% kidney function. And they looked at mean total protein ratio. They looked at mean total protein and plant protein to total protein ratio, and the average follow-up was 8.4 years. And the results show that in people with 60% kidney, less than 60% kidney function, every 33% increase in plant protein to total protein ratio was associated with a 23% lower risk of mortality. So this is beneficial in CKD patients as well. Then in the other 2 things that I just wanted to mention before moving on to other aspects is in Nurses' Health Study 1 and 2 and health professionals follow-up study, higher intake of animal protein is associated with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes compared with higher intake of vegetable protein. So we know there is almost 50% of our population with kidney disease has diabetes. So it could have consequences there. In Nurses' Health Study, women with chronic kidney disease consuming a high animal protein diet had a significantly greater decline in GFR than women who consumed more plant protein. So what are the goals for diet therapy for people with chronic kidney disease who are vegetarians? So these are sort of the general goals that we follow for our population with kidney disease. Decrease the rate of progression, decrease protein in the urine, minimize catabolism of protein, maintain good nutritional status, provide sufficient calories and protein, minimize uremic toxicity, correct metabolic acidosis, and reduce the complications which are associated with chronic kidney disease. So when we talk about vegetarianism and chronic kidney disease, naturally the questions that come to our mind are, is the vegetarian diet nutritionally safe in people with kidney disease or who are on dialysis? Because adverse outcomes are associated when you're malnourished, And we know that in chronic kidney disease, malnutrition starts to increase as the kidney function slows down, and more than 50% of our dialysis population is malnourished. So naturally, the question about malnutrition is paramount in everybody's mind. Would we be able to attain adequate protein intake to meet the requirement of chronic kidney disease and the increased need for protein when our patients are on dialysis? And would we be able to prevent weight loss by making sure that we are providing sufficient calories? Will we be able to manage calcium, potassium, and phosphorus levels within the acceptable limits? And would one need supplements? And what about calcium, iron, B12, vitamin D, and zinc status? So these are some of the questions that we are hoping we can look at. So starting with protein, there are two separate things that come to mind. What about the quality and what about the quantity? Usually people think that animal proteins are superior somehow. Well, superior proteins means that you have a higher maybe amount or percentage of essential amino acids in it because they have to be consumed from diet. But are they really? So when you go back to the 70s, the theory used to be that you have to complement foods in such a way that one lacking amino acid in one food is complemented by another food which has that amino acid and may be lacking in something else. So if you pair them together like rice and beans, then you have a full complement of essential amino acids. So as long as our diet has variety, because all foods have essential amino acids in it, they just come in different composition and different proportions. But we have a storage pool of amino acids, so we don't have to do it meal by meal. Over the course of a day, we can consume different foods, and as long as we meet our energy needs and we have sufficient variety, we can meet our essential amino acid requirements. We don't have to complement them. So when we look at vegetarian diets and their protein intake in a healthy population, the recommendation for protein is 0.8 grams of protein per kilo. So this level meets the protein requirement of 95% of the population. So when we look at the Adventist health study too, so Seventh-day Adventists are strict vegetarians, and they've been followed over a long period of time. There are 95,000 people being followed. So a lot of things are derived, a lot of information is derived from that. And they found that they can meet their protein requirements. The average protein intake in them is about 73 grams a day. So there was no problem there. In the EPIC Oxford study that I talked about earlier, the protein intake was about 13% of the energy requirement, which is more than what is recommended for sufficiency in UK and US. So they can meet their protein requirements. Then they did a crossover study of vegetarians in California, and they found that the average came to 1.04 grams of protein per kilo. So they were able to make adequate protein for their needs. So what about chronic kidney disease? The requirement for chronic kidney disease without dialysis used to be 0.6 at one point, but for the last 20 years or so, it is around 0.8 grams per kilo. And it increases by approximately 50% or more when our patients are on dialysis, and that is to compensate the need for losses of protein and amino acids. So what about biological value? When we make recommendations, we have been telling our patients, okay, make sure 50% of your protein requirement is coming from the high biological value proteins. But the literature is really telling us that that's sort of redundant. We don't need to rely on biological value anymore because there are other ways of assessing the adequacy or the quality of protein. And one of the methods, I'm sure you have heard of that, is PD-CAS, which is Protein Digestibility Corrected Amino Acid Score. And what it does is basically that you look for the content of the first limiting amino acid in a test protein and compare it to a reference standard, and you get a PD-Cas value, and we will look at some of these values here. So when you look at different proteins, you see casein and whey protein are milk proteins. So their PD-Cas value is 1, which is the standard perfect. Then when you look at egg, it is 1. Look at milk, it is 1. Look at soy protein, it is 1. So soy protein quality is excellent as far as protein qualities is concerned. But some of the other, I mean, even when you look at the first one, beef, that is below 1 value. So why haven't we been using this as a standard for measuring protein quality? It is because we don't have values available for a lot of proteins. It's said that you can calculate those values, but I don't know who would really venture to do that. So some of the newer proteins like pea protein, quinoa protein, I don't think we know the PD-Cas values as yet. But maybe sometime in the future when we have more information, this will be the way of telling our patients, choose proteins based on these values. And I understand that in the lunch programs in the US, their recommendation is that they should have a PD-Cas value of 0.8 to be including in a vegetarian lunch. But when you combine, if one food has a value 0.6, another food has a value 0.6, by combining them, they could become 0.8. So that's something to think about. So what about protein in chronic kidney disease patients? So these two studies that I picked and mentioned are really going back in time to the 80s almost, because there isn't a lot of information. I mean, there are a lot of cohort studies that are around, but when you look at the percentage of vegetarians, it's small. So to get any kind of numbers in order to get information is fairly limited at this time. So these studies in CKD patients show that in the Italian study, they followed these patients for 13 months, and they complemented their proteins in the diet, and they found that there were no nutritional issues identified at the end of 13 months. In the second study, too, they gave them 0.75 grams of protein per kilo, and they followed a vegan diet for 6 months, and there were no issues with nutrition there. So the suggestion is that people who are on dialysis are able to maintain adequate protein intake without signs of compromise. So we know that high-protein diets have had association with hyperfiltration, increasing protein in the urine, and accelerating progression of kidney disease. So when you look at the recommendation, plant-based diets are closer to the average requirement for protein in the healthy population, as well as for the low-protein diet goal, which we call it low protein, but it is really adequate protein intake in CKD population as well. So one of the recent reviews that came out said that the concerns regarding malnutrition and protein energy wasting using the plant-based diets are not really founded. We can really do it. So this is dietary protein sources. So we looked at we can meet the quantitative need, we can meet the qualitative need, and so this is very interesting because it is the atherosclerosis risk in community study. So they have almost 12,000 adults with greater than 60% kidney function, so that's pretty good, normal. And the median follow-up is 23 years. So what they're looking for is how many people developed chronic kidney disease. And so the results showed that the highest quartile of vegetable protein reduced risk of incident CKD by 24% compared to the lowest quartile of vegetable protein. And red processed meat increased chronic kidney disease by 23%. And when they substituted 1 serving a day of red meat or processed meat with some of these vegetarian sources, the chronic kidney disease risk decreased by nuts 19%, legumes 17%, low-fat dairy 15%, even fish and seafood by 11%. So that's really good. So what about nutritional status? Can patients maintain nutritional status on dialysis? So out of the criteria was they have to be on dialysis for more than 6 months, and 19 out of 318 patients were vegetarian. So this gives you an idea of prevalence right here. So their protein catabolic rate in the vegetarian group was slightly less, 1.1 versus 1.2 in non-vegetarians. Albumin was maintained. The BMI and mid-arm circumference were lower in vegetarians. Hematocrit was similar because the iron stores, ferritins tend to be lower in vegetarians, but they just required a higher EPO dose. And the muscle strength evaluated by hand grip test, SGA, and the activities of daily living were similar. So, it can be said that vegetarians can maintain status. So this case study I just presented, because it's not really a case study, it is showing there is a young male who was admitted, who had hypertension, was admitted with acute kidney injury with a creatinine of more than 800, and creatinine at discharge was 530. He was diagnosed with pulmonary renal syndrome, and when I saw him in the outpatient clinic, basically as a new patient, and he was a non-vegetarian who had, in the meantime, switched to a vegetarian type of diet. So what is he doing now? So when you look at the diet history, this patient is eating chapati or a bread in the morning and a vegetable, cabbage, drinking a cup of tea. His snack is just either apple or berries. He's not eating any third fruit. His lunch was rice and cabbage, and the dinner was rice and eggplant curry and tea. And he said he may eat an egg once a week or so. So this person required about 55 grams of protein a day, and his potassium and phosphorus were fine. And when I saw him, I said to him, this diet does not look right. This is very imbalanced. You have no protein sources here. And he said, I'm going to avoid protein because I don't want my creatinine to go up, and I don't want my phosphorus to go up. So as you can tell, this person has an East Indian way of eating. And I said to him, you have to at least include lentils and legumes and those kind of things which you can easily eat, and nuts into the regime. He said, no, my phosphorus will go up. So anyway, he agreed to try. And two or 3 months later, when I saw him, he said, I don't want to follow your diet. My phosphorus went up from 1.36 to 1.39. This was that kind of a patient. So the point is that we are making is when you try to follow some kind of a vegan diet, you have to have really well-planned diet and a lot of discipline in making it right. Otherwise, you're opening yourself to a lot of holes. Okay, so to come to the next polling question. So this is the question. What are the most common used protein foods in your vegetarian CKD patients? Okay, ready? Okay. Okay. I would have expected maybe the meat analogs to be a little higher, but that's interesting. It's pretty low. And I didn't expect legumes and lentils and beans to be that high, but I'm told that it also can vary with region. So it depends on what kind of population you have that will affect the intake of different choices. Okay, so now we're going to switch into vegetarian diets and phosphorus. It looks like I'm not moving at a fast enough pace. Okay, so because I've got only half covered so far. All right, so phosphorus values that we see from the food composition tables are based on digestibility, and do they really reflect true phosphorus exposure? And we all understand that phosphorus is available differently from different category of foods. So when you look at the animal foods, the phosphorus is bound to the molecules where we have enzymes to cleave it, so we have more than 70% phosphorus available from them. In plant sources, it's stored as phytates. Humans don't have phytase enzymes, so maybe 40–50% phosphorus is bioavailable. For food additives, it exists as chemical salts. They are dissociable in water, and they're readily absorbed, and the literature tells us that 90–100% of these are absorbed. So adjusting for bioavailability will have implications on how we manage the phosphorus levels. The recommendations for phosphorus, let's say, are 800 to 1,000 milligrams a day. And higher the protein in the diet, the higher phosphorus level you're going to have. And there are equations which are developed which can predict that if you had, let's say, for a 70-kilo person, 84 grams of protein, you're going to get approximately 1,000 milligrams of phosphorus, which is already exceeding the amount. So in a balance-wise study, which was looking at protein and phosphorus relationship, what they found is that even for the same level of phosphorus, you could have a range of phosphorus. And different equations will give you 1,000 to 1,400 milligrams of phosphorus range, and it is made further complicated by how much calories you are consuming. So in the study, they excluded people who were eating less than 500 calories or more than 4,000 calories, and they found that obviously the more calories you ate, your phosphorus intake will be higher too. So it is affected by protein and calories in the diet. Now, why do we use phosphorus additives in processed foods? So they are used for all kinds of reasons, that they can be used as emulsifiers, they can be used to improve taste, they could be used to maybe change the texture, to improve the appearance, so that the chicken that you put in the oven is not going to burn, but stay in there longer. So the intake of processed foods provides additional 300 to 1,000 milligrams of phosphorus from the food additives. And the problem is that information about phosphorus is not mandated to be on the label, so it is very difficult for us to find unless, I went into the grocery store trying to find a product on which I could find a phosphate salt, and the usual foods that are associated with higher additives, I couldn't find a phosphate label in the ingredient list in some of those foods. So we have to really look at the section here in order to teach our patients that we need to look at the ingredient list. So are phosphorus additives really absorbed 90 to 100%? And this is in healthy adults, and there were 3 crossover feeding studies, and they looked at 24-hour urine phosphorus after giving a specific amount of phosphorus. So when you look at all 3 of these studies, there were small number of patients, and they were not looking for phosphorus bioavailability as the endpoint. They were associated with osteoporosis and mineral turnover, et cetera. But the additives for phosphorus showed 48% absorption in one, 54% in another, and 36 and 46% in another. So this review said that it did not support that phosphorus additives are absorbed 90 to 100%. Maybe they absorbed less, and it depends on interactions with other nutrients, whether it is magnesium, whether it's calcium, whether it is aluminum, or whatever. So this one was a crossover study to look at the phosphorus in homeostasis in CKD, and their kidney function was at level 3 or 4, but there were only 8 patients in it. And it showed that 1 week of vegetarian diet led to lower serum phosphorus levels and decreased FGF23 levels, which is a good thing. And so the source of protein has a significant effect on phosphorus management in in patients. So when we do education with patients, we should also look at where the phosphorus is coming from, what is the source. And what to do to restrict phosphorus without compromising protein intake, because that's one of the big things which we worry about. So avoid processed foods so that we get fewer phosphate additives. Cook food from fresh ingredients. Use foods or select foods which have less bioavailable phosphorus, and use extra phosphate binders, which we all know, in order to have a better control. And this is easier said than done because we live in an age of convenience, and a lot of people are using prepared and processed foods, and it's hard to get them away from it. So here, this is phosphorus milligrams per gram of protein. This is the actual amount of phosphorus in the first column, and in the second one, it is the adjusted amount, which is based on digestibility and absorption. So you'll see that the dairy products still stand out as higher phosphorus to per gram of protein ratio. So when you look at tofu, it comes out so much better. When you look at yogurt and milk and cheese, you've got much higher values there. And cottage cheese looks pretty low too. So what about potassium? So this is another good review that came out, and it showed that there is a weak association between the potassium level and the dietary intake of potassium. And what came out is that if your potassium in diet ranged from 500 milligrams to 4,500, the serum potassium was only 0.4 milliequivalents higher. And also the balance-wise study showed that serum potassium is not affected so much by diet potassium. So there must be other factors that affect serum potassium as well. But they also found that the diet potassium that dietitians get referral for, more than 50% of it is not related to diet. So what are the other things that affect potassium balance? You know, if you're on ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers, whether you're having tissue breakdown and you are catabolic, you break muscle and you release potassium out into the bloodstream where it is measured, or if you are constipated, if your blood sugar control is not good, if your acid-base balance is out of line, all those factors affect potassium levels. And also we know that there is constipation in 53% of hemo patients. And when you don't have much urine output, the bowel function takes over and you excrete more potassium in the bowel movements than otherwise. So compared to controls that put out 12% of potassium in the bowel movements, hemo patients had 3 times as much. And so the plant-based diets, which are based on fruits and vegetables, are high in fiber. They provide base and alkaline media and shift potassium into cells, increase fecal bulk, and more potassium is excreted that way. So what about alkaline diet and metabolic acidosis? The negative consequences of metabolic acidosis, you know, I would just say protein degradation, and the type of diet affects metabolic acidosis by providing either the base or the acid to the medium. So when you look at the formula where the potential renal acid load is looked at, the things that contribute towards acid-providing foods is protein and phosphorus, and the ones which provide base are potassium, magnesium, and calcium. So our ancestral diets were, let's say, minus 88 milliequivalents per day, which is an alkaline diet, compared to our North American diet now is plus 44. So the modern day diets are all acid-producing, and so anything which is in a negative is increasing the alkaline base, and anything which is positive is giving you acid. So meat, eggs, cheese, and grains increase acid production, and fruits and vegetables have alkaline effect, and milk is neutral. So these 3 studies were done to see if fruits and vegetables can do the same as sodium bicarbonate does. So in stage 2, 3, and 4, these were 3 separate studies. They used extra fruits and vegetables versus giving bicarbonate, and they found that fruits and vegetables were dosed so that the dietary acid load could be reduced by 50%. And they found that both the treatments, whether you use fruits and vegetables or sodium bicarbonate, were able to achieve the same thing. The only thing is that they didn't induce hyperkalemia, but they also selected patients who didn't have diabetes and didn't have potassium levels greater than 4.5. So then, to look at the microbiome, which is a big thing coming up for the future, is that when you use plant-based diets, you create less inflammation, and inflammatory scores are associated with decline in kidney function. And I think I came across 2 or 3 articles just in the last couple of months. So what happens is the plant-based diets strengthen the gut barrier so that you have decreased translocation of inflammation-causing compounds which come from uremia and are uremic toxins. So when you follow low potassium, low phosphorus diet, some of the things that strengthen the gut flora and change microbiome are affected. So what you eat definitely affects your microbiome. And I thought I'll just put this up because the powders concentrate and isolate as the refining of protein food takes place. You're getting higher level of protein, you're getting rid of fiber, you're getting rid of lactose, you're getting rid of fat, and all these have different uses in products if you need a protein supplement. And soy protein will be a good candidate for people who are not using dairy products. So I think in the interest of time, I'll just skip this over. I can come back to it. I will just go on from here on sodium. In general, vegetarian diets tend to be lower in sodium. That is if you are cooking products yourself and not going so much into meat analogs and so on. And so when you look at this label, I picked it up on purpose because the protein here is 26 grams, the sodium is 660 milligrams, and there are not too many unnatural products added as additives here. There are not so many chemicals. It's mostly minerals and vitamins that I noticed in particular. So when you look at B12, it's 160% of the requirement. So that's pretty good. So label reading and looking at products to get this information is helpful. Okay, so what vegetarian dish can I prepare for Thanksgiving or Christmas for my vegetarian guests that's not tofurkey? So this was a question that was raised in one of the newspapers that, I want to be respectful to my guests and I don't want to feed them a manufactured food item. So this just gives you, you're really going to replace the meat with all the options that are available. There is no magic solutions you're going to bring. You're using these products and you're just going to make nice dishes based on them. So I just thought I'll put up a few examples. But what I really find is that the raw soybeans that you get in the frozen section, they're like excellent source of protein and really tasty. And I had lentil meatballs on pasta sauce. The sauce was made with cashews, was delicious, was really good. So it's not impossible to find, different interesting items. So now I'm just going to spend maybe 5 minutes going over minerals and vitamins of concern and then just sort of wrap it up. So first thing is iron. So iron, calcium, B12, vitamin D, these 4 are the things that we regularly measure in our dialysis population. So we know that vegetarians have lower iron stores. And the absorption of iron is dependent on if you're deficient what the meal composition is, and whether it's a heme iron or non-heme iron. So we absorb about 18% of iron from the heme iron versus 10% from non-heme iron. And it is also affected by the presence of inhibitors versus enhancers. So if you have vitamin C, it'll enhance the vitamin C, or citrate will enhance the absorption of iron. As far as calcium is concerned, lacto-ovo-vegetarians don't need to worry about calcium. They can meet their requirement fairly easily. Vegans may vary, or they may fall below recommendations, so they would be at risk for fractures. But I also came across a study where they showed that if the vegans could get in about, let's say, 580 milligrams of calcium in their diet, that removed this fracture risk from their diet. But you'll need several sources of calcium in your food, and you'll also have to avoid the ones which are high in oxalate, because that calcium is not so readily available. It could be 5% calcium that you'll absorb from foods which are high in oxalate, and it could be 50% from the ones which are not high in oxalate. And calcium-set tofu, fortified plant milk, cow's milk, you absorb about 30% calcium. Vitamin D is very closely monitored in our patients, and we know that vegetarians could have lower 25-hydroxy-D levels. And the fortification is mostly breakfast cereals, non-dairy milks, fruit juices, margarines, etc. And if you needed supplements, a vegan will need the plant origin D supplement, which is D2, and the others could use D3 or D2. And we need active vitamin D when the kidney function is lower. B12 is not a component of plant foods, so people who are vegans will definitely need a B12 supplement, because the fermented foods, which are sources of small amount of B12, are never going to be adequate to provide sufficient B12. And the absorption mechanism for B12 is the intrinsic factor we have in our gastric system, where that system gets saturated at half the RDA level. So you have to include fortified foods at least twice a day in order to get sufficient B12 from it, and because the intrinsic factor gets saturated, and so B12 supplement is definitely needed. Then zinc. Adult vegetarians have zinc intake that is similar to or lower than non-vegetarians, and zinc levels are a little lower, but they are still within the normal range. And overt zinc deficiency is not evident in Western vegetarians, because as you see, the zinc sources are basically all the foods that are included in the vegetarian diet. So polling question 4. What are your concerns in planning a vegetarian CKD diet? Okay, ready? Okay. Potassium is coming up at top. Okay, I thought maybe phosphorus will be too. Okay, that's good. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap it up now. So to summarize here, planning a vegetarian diet, individualize meal pattern, understand cultural eating habits, which is really important, knowledge of availability of meat analogs, nutrient content of milk substitutes and tofu, substitute lower potassium fruits and vegetables for higher potassium ones to accommodate legumes, nuts, and seeds, monitor caloric intake, so to make sure that they're getting sufficient calories, use supplements if protein or calorie supplements are required, supplement with B12, vitamin D, calcium and iron, and zinc based on serum levels, and adjust dialysate potassium to a lower K bath to get the potassium right, use more phosphate binding if necessary, educate patients to check the ingredient list on packaged foods, and making sure that patients get adequate dialysis. So to conclude, plant-based diets can be safely added to our patient's diet. They provide same quality protein as animal protein. You can maintain nutritional status. You can maintain phosphorus and potassium with adequate measures. You can correct or improve metabolic acidosis, plus additional benefits of lowering inflammation, providing more fiber, more bulk, and all kinds of reducing risk for better blood sugar control, mortality, and all those things. So it is not necessary to become 100% vegetarian or vegan, but small changes with one meal at a time with recipe support are a step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Veena. That was great. I'm not sure if people have questions. We certainly are here to answer what we have. There's a couple that were listed in the app. One is, may we have a copy of your presentation?
Well, I understood that the copy will be relayed to everyone who is registered.
I think it will be on the BC Kidney Days website, but I will certainly confirm that.
And I have a long list of references at the back, so references are there. You will be able to check them out.
And there is one question here that says, are there many studies looking at plant versus, animal protein for people on dialysis?
Well, as I said, the studies will be limited because of the lower percentage of vegans or vegetarians. Because, if you come across something not very often, you get 2 people who follow a vegan diet in a year, every time you'll have to read up and look up information in order to be able to talk to them. And, one of our nephrologists, I was discussing, he looked at my presentation and he said, that is going to be the problem in future, that we won't have many numbers, because to start with, it's easier to follow a cohort of patients and derive observations and information from that. But when you actually design trials and try to do randomized control trials, you have to have sufficient numbers to bring power to your conclusions. And people find it very difficult to follow diets without very close scrutiny as far as compliance is concerned. So those studies will be hard, but I think with all the focus that is coming to plant-based diets, because I'm absolutely amazed by the number of references that are coming out from every which corner in this direction. And as the numbers increase, maybe people will undertake those studies, but maybe it'll be a multi-center trial, but I don't know how many nephrologists are going to be active in pushing this forward. And we have a couple of nephrologists who are vegetarians. And in our hospital, we have a gastroenterologist who turned vegan. And one day when I looked at him, he seemed so much thinner. I thought he was sick. There was something wrong with him. He said, no, he became vegan, and he lost 20 pounds. And he's got a group going in the hospital. And it's amazing that they are getting together all these staff, hospital staff. Anybody who discovers that they're diagnosed with diabetes, or they want to lose 10, 15 pounds, they're all becoming his disciples. He's got like a cult going in the hospital. They meet every couple of months, and they bring ideas for one meal at a time. Okay, we are going to change our breakfast into a vegan diet. Okay, so what are we going to do? What does this person get? What does this person get? And all these people are taking interest, but again, predominantly females.
There's one more question on the app, and it's about phosphate additives. The information that you presented partly said that phosphate additives are absorbed at 90 to 100%, and then a further study that said there was much less absorption. So it's my question. So what I'm wondering is what you actually tell your patients. Is it just that phosphate additives are an additional phosphate load and should be avoided because of that? Or?
Well, you still cannot tell them not to worry about phosphate additives because they still contribute that amount. But we haven't really studied this topic in so much detail to be able to say, they're only absorbed just like a vegetable protein. So if vegetable protein sources, you absorb 40 to 50%. How much different is that from additives? It's not. So you'll still tell them to avoid them, but maybe they're, I don't know. I went back to the studies where they first started advocating for phosphate additives and phosphorus, and I think I could see them up to 2005. And those are the articles that started the whole fervor about it, which were phosphate additives in beverages, in cereals, and meats, etc. And everybody just got on that bandwagon that this is how much phosphorus you absorb from the additives. But when you look at some of the studies I presented, they are in healthy adults, they are not in chronic kidney disease, and they had different things that they were looking for. This was just like a side thing that they noticed, that phosphorus wasn't being absorbed 90 to 100%, but maybe around 40%, 50% or so. So time will tell. I don't tell people to use convenience food with phosphate additives, because I think avoiding them is still beneficial, but I don't know what to base it on. These are just some of the ideas I threw out because I don't know myself.
So thank you very much, Veena.